There is a village at the edge of the Gobi, where the wind never quite stops moving, and where, for the better part of a century, certain children have been born with the wrong eyes. Not wrong in any medical sense, green, sometimes, or a washed-out hazel that doesn't match their cousins, their parents, their grandparents going back as far as anyone can name them. In Yongchang County, Gansu province, there are families whose noses curve where the noses around them run flat, whose hair, in youth, carries a reddish cast that no one in the surrounding villages can explain. The land itself gives no hints either way. It's a hard, beige country of low rammed earth walls and scattered poplar windbreaks, the kind of place where summer dust storms can turn midday the colour of weak tea, and where winter arrives off the steppe with almost no warning at all. People have farmed this corridor of the old Silk Road for 2,000 years, watching caravans and armies pass through on their way to somewhere else, rarely the destination themselves. It is, on the surface, an entirely unremarkable stretch of frontier China, until you look closely at certain faces. For decades, the explanation people reached for was a Roman one, not a metaphor, not a folk tale dressed up for tourists, though it has certainly become that too. An actual claim that the blood in these veins traces back to soldiers of Rome, men who marched east under eagles, who vanished from every Latin record after a catastrophe in the Mesopotamian desert, and who, according to one persistent and seductive theory, kept marching until they ran out of continent, 3,000 miles from the nearest Roman road. A name on the map, Liqian, that sounds, when you say it the right way, uncomfortably close to the Chinese word for Rome itself. A battle in the Han Dynasty's official chronicles, describing soldiers in a strange foreign formation that no one in that part of the world had ever used before or since. And a man named Kai Junian, photographed for international newspapers throughout the 1990s and 2000s, his pale eyes and prominent nose used again and again to illustrate a story almost too good to be true. Almost. That word is going to matter a great deal before tonight is over. If you're settling in, go ahead and get comfortable, under the blankets, lights down, wherever you do your best falling asleep. If you've got a moment, drop where you're tuning in from and what time it reads on your clock right now. I love picturing the map fill in while a story like this one unfolds. Lost soldiers and lost villages scattered across a globe of viewers, each tucked into their own private night. And if a calm, well-sourced mystery is your kind of company before sleep, a like or a subscribe helps this little candle of a channel keep burning. Now, pull the blanket up. We start, as the legend insists we must, in the desert. Before we can understand the battle that started everything, we need to understand the man who chose to walk into it, and why Rome, in the winter of 54 BC, looked east with the eyes of a civilization that believed it could not lose. Marcus Licinius Crassus was born around 115 BC into a family that was respected but not spectacular, senatorial by rank but without the kind of military glory that translated into lasting fame in Roman culture. His father, Publius Licinius Crassus, had been consul in 97 BC and had earned a triumph for his military service in Spain, the highest honour Rome could offer a general. The full parade through the city, with captives and spoils and crowds lining the streets. But when the civil war between Sulla and Marius tore through Rome in the 80s BC, the family ended up on the losing side. His father and brother both died. The young Crassus fled to Spain with practically nothing and remade himself from the ground up, which tells you something important about the kind of man he was. Not someone defeat broke, but someone it sharpened. He came back to Italy with Sulla and made himself useful in the war that put Sulla in power. He was there at the Battle of the Colline Gate in 82 BC, where Sulla's forces defeated the last major resistance to his dictatorship, and while other officers accepted honour and modest rewards, Crassus accepted land, confiscated properties bought for almost nothing from men who had been proscribed, outlawed, their assets seized. He bought silver mines, he bought slaves, hundreds of them, and trained them as architects and builders. He bought buildings that had caught fire in Rome's crowded neighbourhoods, then rebuilt them for resale. According to Plutarch, he made part of his fortune from buying the burning properties themselves at the moment of crisis, driving down the price with the threat of letting them burn, then having his own private fire brigade extinguish the flames. It was entirely legal. It was also the kind of business that made him genuinely hated, and he seems not to have cared particularly. By the time the first triumvirate formed in 60 BC, Crassus, Julius Caesar, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known as Pompey the Great, forming an unofficial three-man alliance to manage Roman politics on their own terms, Crassus was worth approximately 7,100 talents by Plutarch's calculation. Modern estimates put that at around 229 tons of silver, equivalent in purchasing power to something north of $1 billion in contemporary terms. He had extensive silver mines in Spain, vast farm estates across the Italian peninsula, hundreds of enslaved workers, and so many rental properties in Rome that, according to Plutarch, the greatest part of Rome came into his hands at one time or another. He was not the most admired man in Rome. He was the most indispensable. But indispensable and celebrated are different things, and that distinction is where the tragedy begins. In a culture that measured a man's ultimate worth in military victories, not silver mines, not political maneuvering, not the gratitude of clients, Crassus stood in the shadow of the other two members of the triumvirate in a way that money could not fix. Pompey had earned his surname by defeating Mithridates of Pontus and reorganizing Rome's entire Eastern Empire. Caesar was in the process of conquering Gaul, adding territory the size of France to Roman dominion, writing dispatches about it that Romans read aloud at dinner parties, and that schoolchildren would be made to copy out for centuries afterward. Crassus had crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus, a genuine military achievement, one he had earned. But even that victory had been partly stolen by Pompey, who arrived with his own legions to mop up the remnants and demanded a share of the credit. Crassus had been given the lesser honour of an ovation rather than a triumph, and he never forgot it. In 56 BC, the three men met at Lucca in northern Italy to renew and expand their arrangement. Under the deal they struck there, Caesar's command in Gaul was extended, while Pompey and Crassus were appointed joint consuls for 55 BC. After their consulship, Pompey received Spain and Crassus received Syria as their proconsular provinces. Syria was enormously wealthy on its own terms, one of the richest provinces in the Roman Empire, a gateway to Eastern trade networks. But what Crassus saw when he looked at Syria was primarily a launching pad. Beyond Syria's eastern border lay Parthia. Beyond Parthia lay the legendary wealth of the further east. And beyond the wealth, in the arithmetic of Roman glory, lay the military triumph that would finally place him alongside Pompey and Caesar, rather than perennially beneath them. He was 60 years old when he took command. He had won one major battle independently, decades earlier, against an enslaved army. He was walking into a war against the most sophisticated cavalry empire in the ancient world, on terrain perfectly suited to that cavalry, and entirely foreign to the legionary tactics on which he planned to rely. The orator Cicero called the war unprovoked, which it was, there being no particular strategic justification for attacking Parthia at that moment beyond Crassus's personal ambitions. A tribune named Ateius Capito staged a public religious curse on the docks. As Crassus departed Italy, a ritual of execration meant to call down disaster on the expedition. Ancient sources record that at least some of the watching crowd believed the curse would take effect. They were right. We don't actually know his personal name. Shurina was the designation of his noble house, the Shuren clan, one of the 7 great aristocratic families of the Parthian Empire, each with hereditary privileges and powers that the Arsacide royal dynasty had to balance carefully against its own authority. The man who commanded the Parthian forces at Carrhae was simply called Shurena. In every Greek and Latin source we have, the way an English lord of an earlier century might have been referred to simply by his family seat. He was, by Plutarch's account, written about 125 years after the battle, but drawn from earlier sources, not yet 30 years old. He was the wealthiest private subject in the Parthian Empire after the king himself. His personal retinue, when travelling, included 1,000 armoured cavalry and a camel train of 1,000 dromedaries to carry his baggage, plus 200 wagons reserved for his harem. A man this rich commanding an army this size was, by Parthian aristocratic tradition, a potential threat to the throne, regardless of how loyal he appeared. That structural problem would prove decisive for him personally, though he would not live to feel the consequences for long. Before Carrhae, Shurena had already demonstrated what kind of commander he was. When the Parthian king, Orodes II, needed to retake the throne he had been temporarily driven from, it was Shurena who restored him, personally leading the assault on the great city of Seleucia and being the first man to scale its walls. He was not a man who commanded from a safe distance. And yet, his physical appearance, as Plutarch describes it with barely concealed Roman confusion, was not what you might expect. He painted his face, he parted his hair after the medium fashion, and his dress suggested something that struck Roman observers as more court aristocrat than battlefield commander. This was exactly the kind of misjudgment the Romans would carry into the campaign itself, seeing surfaces rather than substance, and paying for it in blood. His tactical approach at Carrhae was not improvised. It was the product of a military tradition built over generations on the Iranian plateau, where mobility was life, and the open steppe rewarded a very particular kind of warfare. The Parthian army he fielded was composed of two complementary forces, cataphracts, the heavy armoured shock cavalry, who rode horses also clad in scale mail and carried long lances designed to punch through shield and breastplate at speed, and the horse archers, who constituted the larger and more devastating part of his force. These men could ride at full gallop, turn in the saddle, and loose arrows backward with devastating accuracy. The manoeuvre that passed into the English language as the Parthian shot, which we still use today to mean a cutting remark delivered while walking away, though almost nobody who uses the phrase has any idea of its origin. What made Shirena's force genuinely revolutionary, and what Crassus had no way to anticipate, was the logistics behind it. Previous Roman encounters with nomadic cavalry had broken down when the archers exhausted their arrows and had to fall back. Shirena solved this with camel trains, 1,000 of them, carrying replacement arrows and moving with the army. When a quiver ran empty, resupply was available within minutes, not hours. The Roman soldiers who spent the long, terrible afternoon at Carrhae, waiting for the arrow storm to slow down, waited in vain. The camels kept coming. The Parthian archers never ran out. In the spring of 53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus marched east with 7 legions, somewhere between 36 and 40,000 men, depending on which ancient tally you trust, convinced that Parthia would fall to him the way Spartacus's slave army once had. He had been warned, and by people worth listening to. The Roman orator Cicero called the war unprovoked. A tribune named Ateius Capito staged a public ritual of execration on the docks as Crassus departed, cursing the expedition before it had even left Italian soil. Crassus's own questor, a sharp, lean young officer named Gaius Cassius Longinus, yes, at Cassius, 14 years before he would help drive a dagger into Caesar, urged him to keep the army close to the Euphrates River, where supply lines were safe and Parthian cavalry had less room to manoeuvre. Crassus's son Publius joined him in Syria that same winter, fresh from genuine distinction, serving under Julius Caesar in Gaul, bringing with him 1,000 Gallic cavalrymen who would prove, in the battle to come, some of the only Roman-aligned troops capable of matching Parthian horsemen for speed, if not for numbers. An Armenian ally, King Artavasdes, arrived separately with an offer of 6,000 cavalry and a standing invitation to invade through the mountains to the north. Where the terrain would have denied the Parthians the open ground their tactics depended on entirely. Crassus turned the offer down twice, trusting instead in the size of his infantry and in a swift crossing of the Euphrates that would prove, within months, to be the single worst decision of the entire campaign. Lured by an Arab guide named Ariamnes, a man possibly in Parthian pay, or simply someone whose loyalties shifted with the wind, the legions struck out into open desert in pursuit of an enemy that was never where it appeared to be. Some historians have since questioned whether Ariamnes was as deliberately treacherous as the ancient sources suggest, arguing that the route he took was a legitimate caravan road with adequate water in spring. What mattered was the outcome. Crassus found himself on flat, featureless ground with no cover, no defensive advantage, and no cavalry worth the name, approaching an enemy cavalry force that had been built specifically to exploit exactly these conditions. What met them? Near a town called Carrhae, modern Haran in southeastern Turkey, was a Parthian force perhaps a quarter the size of the Roman army, but built entirely around something the legions had no answer for. Picture it the way Plutarch later described it, writing more than a century afterward, but drawing on eyewitness accounts that haven't survived independently. 10,000 horsemen under Shirena, a smaller corps of armoured cataphracts riders and horses both sheathed in mail from head to thigh, carrying lances built to punch through shield and breastplate alike. Around them, a far larger screen of horse archers, men who could loose arrows at a full gallop and, when pressed, wheel and fire backward over their own mount's tail. Before the battle even properly began, Sharina deployed psychological warfare. The Parthians began beating massive hollow drums, their sound described by ancient sources as something like the growl of wild beasts or the rolling of thunder, a noise calibrated to unsettle men who had never heard anything like it. It worked. The Roman soldiers, who had been hoping to engage in the familiar close-quarters combat that their training and their weapons were built for, instead found themselves standing in a drumbeat, in a desert, facing an enemy that simply refused to come within javelin range. The legions formed their famous square. It did nothing. Camel trains kept the Parthian archers supplied with fresh arrows for hour after hour, and the Romans, packed shoulder to shoulder, had nowhere to retreat, and no cavalry of their own worth the name. Crassus's own son, Publius, led a desperate sortie of cavalry and light infantry to break the encirclement, was cut off from the main body, and died alongside nearly all of his men on a low rise of ground. The Parthians raised his severed head on a spear and rode it along the Roman line, close enough that Crassus could be made to recognize his own child. By nightfall, an estimated 20,000 Romans lay dead. Roughly 10,000 more had been taken prisoner. Crassus himself, lured into a parley days later under false promise of negotiation, was killed in the chaos that followed, and according to a story that later Roman writers couldn't resist repeating, molten gold was poured down his throat by his captors, a grim joke about the avarice that had brought him there in the first place. Cassius Dio is the main source for this detail, and it is exactly the kind of story that may have been elaborated in the retelling, satisfying in narrative terms, impossible to verify. What is certain is that Crassus died, that his head was sent to the Parthian king, and that somewhere in a performance of Euripides' Bacchae being staged at the Parthian court, the actor playing Agave entered carrying a severed head that the audience reportedly could not tell at first was genuine. It remains, alongside Carrhae and Adrianople, one of the three worst military disasters in the long span of Roman history. The hours before that ending were their own kind of slow-motion catastrophe, and Plutarch lingers on them in a way that's worth lingering on too. When word of Publius's death reached the main column, Crassus tried to rally his men with a speech, the way a Roman commander was supposed to. Plutarch says plainly that few of the soldiers paid him much attention, and that when Crassus called for a cheer, the army managed only a faint, uneven noise back at him, the sound more or less of an army that already knew how the day was going to end. Crassus wrapped his cloak around himself afterward and withdrew into something close to a private collapse, leaving Cassius and a legate named Octavius to organise the night retreat to Carrhae without him. That retreat had its own casualties, separate from the battle itself. 4 cohorts under a legate named Vargontaeus lost their bearings in the dark, were caught in the open by Parthian riders the next morning, and were wiped out almost to a man. All but 20 soldiers, who fought their way clear with enough ferocity that the Parthians, by one account, let them walk the rest of the way to Carrhae unmolested. A strange flicker of respect inside an otherwise merciless pursuit. A smaller party of 300 cavalry, under an officer named Ignatius, reached the town first. In the dead of night, shouted a warning to the sentries on the wall in Latin, and then rode straight on towards Zeugma, without stopping to explain himself further, saving his own men, and earning, in Plutarch's account, a lasting reputation for abandoning his commander in the process. Rome's humiliation didn't end with the bodies left on the sand. The Parthians, holding a captive who happened to resemble Crassus closely enough to make the joke land, dressed him in women's clothing, and paraded him through Parthian territory, ordering the watching crowds to hail him as imperator, a deliberate, theatrical mockery of the triumphal procession Crassus had wanted for himself back in Rome. It is the kind of detail easy to read past quickly, and hard to forget once you've actually pictured it. An empire's vanity, restaged as a public joke, on the body of a man who had no say in the matter at all. And somewhere in that desert, 10,000 Roman soldiers walked into Parthian captivity, and, as far as any surviving Latin document is concerned, simply stopped existing. The man who won this victory, Sharina, was executed by his own king within a year of the battle. Orodes II, having initially celebrated the triumph, grew afraid of the general's reputation and the independence his victory had demonstrated. A military commander who could rout an entire Roman consular army using his own initiative without needing the king for anything was structurally dangerous to a monarch who depended on maintaining balance among competing noble houses. So Sharena, who had been not yet 30 years old at Carrhae, who was by every account the most brilliant battlefield commander of his generation, died, probably in 52 BC, on orders from the king he had just saved. History has this habit of consuming the very people who push it forward. It is worth dwelling, before we travel further east, on what the battle unmade back in the city where it started, because the political consequences of Crassus's death rippled through Roman history for decades, and understanding them helps clarify why no one in Rome was paying attention to what happened to the prisoners. When the news reached Rome in the summer of 53 BC, the reaction was shock, grief, and something darker underneath. The beginning of a reckoning about what the Roman army actually was and wasn't capable of. Carrhae broke a specific kind of Roman confidence, not in Rome's ultimate superiority, which virtually no one questioned even then, but in the assumption that the particular tactical toolkit that had served the legions across the Mediterranean would serve them equally everywhere. The open desert with no cover and no rivers and no close terrain was not the world the Roman fighting system was designed for. The cataphract and the horse archer were not the Gallic infantry or the Hellenistic phalanx that Roman legionaries had trained to defeat. Carrhae made visible a seam in Roman power that had previously been invisible, and the fact that it was visible, specifically in the east, specifically against Parthia, meant that the eastern frontier remained a source of anxiety for Roman commanders for the next 2 centuries. Julius Caesar himself had been planning a Parthian campaign before his assassination on the Ides of March in 44 BC. The planned invasion, intended in part to avenge Carrhae, which was still a raw wound in Roman military memory a decade later, was one of the great what-ifs of Roman history. Caesar had spent months preparing, had assembled forces, and had every intention of achieving in Parthia what Crassus had failed to achieve, but through more carefully chosen terrain and more sophisticated tactics. His death in the Senate put an end to those plans, and the ensuing civil wars consumed Roman political energy for another generation. Mark Antony's subsequent attempt to recoup Roman honour in Parthia in 36 BC, the same year as the Battle of Carrhae, was itself a disaster of a different kind. Antony marched east with approximately 100,000 men, the largest Roman force assembled for an eastern campaign, and managed to lose about 24,000 of them to Parthian harassment and logistical failure during a disastrous retreat from the Parthian capital. He achieved essentially nothing, returned to Egypt and Cleopatra, and spent the remainder of his career in the political manoeuvring that eventually led to his defeat by Octavian at Actium in 31 BC. Rome's relationship with its eastern ambitions was, throughout this period, one of humiliation accepted and never quite resolved. Octavian, who became Augustus and the first Roman emperor, eventually found a workable middle path, diplomatic negotiation rather than renewed invasion. The 20 BC agreement that returned the Eagles of Carrhae to Rome was presented as a triumph, celebrated as such with the dedicated arch and the claim in Augustus's own autobiography that he had compelled the Parthians to restore the spoils and standards of 3 Roman armies. What it actually was, if you read the terms carefully, was a peace settlement on roughly equal terms. Neither side conceded its fundamental position, neither side won the war, and the Eagles came back, not because Rome had defeated Parthia, but because Parthia found it diplomatically convenient to return them. Augustus dressed the negotiation in the language of victory because that was what Roman politics required, but the underlying reality was a recognition of stalemate. Carrhae had not been avenged, it had been papered over. This context matters for the story of the prisoners because it explains why, in all the decades of Roman diplomatic engagement with Parthia between 53 BC and 20 BC, the fate of the 10,000 captives was never the primary concern. Recovering the Eagles, those visible symbols of Roman military honour, was the headline demand. The men themselves were secondary in the brutal accounting of Roman imperial priorities to the symbolic objects they had carried. Cassius Dio records something that tends to get lost in the more heroic retellings of the 20 BC settlement. Some of the prisoners, when given the opportunity to return to Rome, declined. They had been in Parthian captivity for 33 years by then, They had presumably built lives there, had children who had never seen Italy, had accommodated themselves to a world that was now genuinely their own, in ways that were hard to disentangle from who they had been before. Some committed suicide from shame rather than return. Some simply refused. The men who walked into Parthian captivity in 53 BC were, 33 years later, not the men who had walked in. They were different people, shaped by different circumstances, with different loyalties and different understandings of themselves. That transformation is worth honouring, even if it makes the romantic narrative of the Lost Legion considerably more complicated. Here is what the Roman record actually preserves about those 10,000 men, and it will not take long to say, because it amounts to almost nothing. We know the legionary eagles captured at Carrhae were not returned to Rome until 20 BC, 33 years later, when the Emperor Augustus negotiated their release as a diplomatic triumph, commemorated afterward with a dedicated arch in the Roman Forum. Pliny the Elder, in his vast encyclopedic survey of the natural world and human geography, published around 77 AD, records that the prisoners were transported to the city of Merv, ancient Alexandria Margiana, on the empire's volatile eastern frontier in what is now Turkmenistan. Merv was not a punishment posting. It was one of the great cities of the ancient world, an oasis settlement on the eastern edge of the Parthian Empire, where the empire needed reliable soldiers to hold an unstable frontier. Using captive military men as garrison forces was standard Parthian practice. Gareth Sampson's 2008 academic study of the battle notes that this march to Merv was itself an extraordinary journey, roughly 1,500 miles across the Middle East and Central Asia, over terrain that ranged from desert to mountain. We have no account of the journey. We don't know how many of the original 10,000 actually made it to Merv alive. We know that some prisoners appear in scattered later references as having intermarried with the local population, as war captives typically did across all ancient cultures when resettlement, rather than execution, was the chosen option. And then the trail goes cold. Plutarch and Cassius Dio, our two principal sources for the battle itself, simply move on to the political fallout in Rome, the collapse of the triumvirate, the slide towards civil war, without telling us what became of the men in Parthian hands. This is not unusual, and it's worth sitting with why before going further. Ancient historians wrote what their audiences cared about, and a Roman audience cared about Roman glory and Roman catastrophe, not about the eventual fate of common soldiers scattered into the custody of a rival empire on the far side of a desert. Nobody in the forum particularly wanted to think about again. Silence in the historical record is rarely a clue by itself. It's simply what most lives, even consequential ones, leave behind. What the sources do follow closely, by contrast, is everything Carrhae set in motion back in Rome itself. Cassius, who had escaped the battlefield with roughly 500 cavalry, spent the next 2 years governing Syria as a proquestor, successfully defending the province against further Parthian incursions and ambushing a Parthian relief column at a town called Antigonea, killing the Parthian second-in-command Osaces in the process. A victory that earned him genuine praise from Cicero. Cassius would go on, eventually, to be one of the chief architects of Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC. 14 years after Carrhae, the lean young officer who had urged Crassus not to cross into that desert, now putting a knife into the man whose political career the triumvirate had originally been designed to protect. The death of Crassus, meanwhile, removed the one figure holding the uneasy alliance between Caesar and Pompey together, and within 4 years that alliance had collapsed entirely into the civil war that would eventually end the Roman Republic altogether. Carrhae, in other words, mattered enormously to Rome, just never as a story about what happened to the prisoners. It mattered as the hinge on which an entire form of government finally gave way. But silence has a way of becoming an invitation, and somewhere in the centuries that followed, a handful of writers, ancient and modern both, looked at that gap and felt the same itch. What if the silence wasn't empty? What if it was simply unrecorded, and the men hadn't vanished so much as kept walking, eastward, further than anyone in Rome had ever thought to look? To understand what the theory actually requires, what it asks us to believe about the 10,000 men, it helps to think concretely about what captivity under the Parthians would have meant in practice. The Parthian Empire was not a monolithic system with a single approach to prisoners of war. Its power rested on a network of great noble houses, each with their own lands and retinues and interests, and the king's authority depended on managing these competing factions rather than simply commanding obedience. Prisoners useful for labour, garrison duties, or skilled craftsmanship were typically resettled rather than killed or enslaved in the chattel sense. They might intermarry, they might be given land in exchange for military service, they might be absorbed into local populations over a generation or two, in ways that left no particular record behind. The Parthian practice of deportation for resettlement along unstable frontiers is documented across multiple periods and contexts. It was how empires of that era managed hostile populations and filled understaffed border zones. Merv itself, where Pliny says the Roman prisoners were sent, was one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world. Sitting at the junction of major trade routes connecting Persia, India, and the steppes to the north, it was a place where Persians, Parthians, Sogdians, Greeks, Indians, and a rotating cast of Central Asian peoples mixed, traded, and intermarried continuously. A group of Latin-speaking soldiers arriving there in the aftermath of 53 BC would have been unusual, but not shocking. Unusual men had been passing through Merv for centuries. Within a generation, through intermarriage and cultural absorption, those same soldiers' children would have spoken Parthian or Sogdian rather than Latin, would have worshipped local gods rather than Roman ones, and would have been indistinguishable from their neighbours in most practical ways. This is, in itself, an important part of the story that tends to get elided in the more romantic retellings. The 10,000 men who entered Parthian captivity in 53 BC were not a single unit, with a single identity that could be preserved intact across decades. They were individuals, with individual fates, individual accommodations with the world they found themselves in, individual decisions about survival and adaptation, and what remained of a life. Some died on the march to Merv, some died of disease in the first years of captivity, some were killed in border skirmishes, fighting as garrison soldiers for the Parthians. Some married local women and had children who never learned a word of Latin. The theory Dubs would eventually propose required a very specific subset of these men, 100 or so, to have maintained enough cohesion as a recognizable military unit, using specifically Roman tactical formations, across 17 years of stateless existence in some of the most volatile political territory on Earth, to be identifiable as such when a Chinese army encountered them in 36 BC. It required them to have escaped or been released from Parthian custody at some point before the Battle of Carrhae. It required them to have specifically found and joined Gigi's service, rather than any of the other regional powers who might have employed mercenary infantry in this period, and it required that, after 17 years of separation from any Roman military institution, they could still execute the testudo formation recognizably enough for a Chinese general to single it out as worthy of note. Each of these requirements is possible in isolation. Stacked together, they describe a chain of events so specific and so unsupported by any documentary evidence at any link in the chain that the honest assessment of the theory has to acknowledge what it is, a possibility, not a probability. A narrative that fits certain isolated facts without being demanded by any of them. The itch as a starting point, and it's almost absurdly small. Among the vast, sprawling miscellany of the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder's first-century encyclopedia, there's a passing mention of Roman military standards being seen, or said to have been seen, far to the east, details thin enough, and translated and retranslated often enough across the centuries, that scholars still argue about exactly what Pliny meant, and how much weight the line can bear. Pliny the Elder himself is worth a moment's consideration, because his natural history is one of the stranger objects in the Roman literary tradition. It's an encyclopedia of practically everything: zoology, botany, medicine, geography, military history, mineralogy, art criticism. Pliny compiled it from roughly 2,000 previous works, wrote it in his spare time while serving as a Roman naval commander, and died when he couldn't resist sailing toward the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD to observe it at closer range. An end so perfectly consistent with his character that it seems almost staged. His work is invaluable as a survey of ancient knowledge, and also frequently wrong, occasionally bizarre, and always worth cross-referencing. When Pliny mentions Roman military standards in the East, the question worth asking is not just what he said, but how confident his information chain actually was, and how many steps removed he was from any eyewitness account. It would be more than a century after Pliny before Rome and China had any contact historians can actually confirm without dispute. The Chinese chronicle, known as the Book of the Later Han, records a Roman diplomatic mission reaching the Han court in 166 AD, sent under the authority of a ruler named Andun, almost certainly the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose full name included the element Antoninus. Even this first confirmed contact, more than 2 centuries after Carrhae, arrived as a trade mission rather than anything resembling a lost army. There was also an earlier and rather poignant near miss in the historical record, one that demonstrates how close the two empires sometimes came to direct contact without ever quite achieving it. In 97 AD, the Han Chinese general Ban Chao dispatched an ambassador named Gan Ying on a mission to reach Rome directly. What would have been an extraordinary diplomatic achievement. Gan Ying made it as far as Mesopotamia, where he intended to continue by sea. The Parthians, who had a direct financial interest in maintaining their monopoly as middlemen on the lucrative Silk Road trade, apparently told him that the sea voyage could take 2 years or more. A significant exaggeration, and Gan Ying, persuaded that the journey was impractical, turned back. Rome and China never made direct diplomatic contact as a result. The intermediaries' vested interest in preventing contact succeeded perfectly. It is one of the great what-ifs of ancient history. That is, more or less, how this entire legend behaves from its first appearance onward. A scrap here, a fragment there, never a smoking gun, always a smudge that a sufficiently motivated eye can shape into a shadow of the right size. His name was Homer Hassenplug Dubs, an American-born sinologist who held a chair in Chinese history at Oxford University. And in 1955, he delivered a lecture before the China Society in London that would outlive him by 70 years and counting. Dobbs's biography is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it matters to how we read his theory. He was born in 1892, the son of American missionaries, and grew up in China. A childhood that gave him a native's instinctive feel for the language and culture that most Western sinologists had to acquire laboriously in adulthood. He returned to the United States for his education, earned a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Chicago in 1925, and spent subsequent decades teaching at the University of Minnesota, Duke University, and Columbia University, before eventually taking the Oxford chair. His translation work on the Han Shu, the official history of the former Han dynasty, one of the foundational texts of Chinese historical scholarship, remains cited and used by sinologists today, regardless of what anyone thinks of his Liqian hypothesis specifically. Dobbs was also remarkably prolific in unexpected directions. He published on ancient Chinese astronomy, on Chinese philosophy, on the relationship between Confucian thought and Western philosophical traditions. He was not, by any account, a man who jumped to conclusions casually or presented speculation as fact without flagging it, which makes his Liqian argument both more interesting and more troubling than a crank's theory would be. It was built with genuine scholarly care, on a foundation that turned out to be too narrow to support the structure he erected on it. His first publication on the subject appeared in the American Journal of Philology in 1941, an ancient military contact between Romans and Chinese, and his fuller treatment, the pamphlet A Roman City in Ancient China, came in 1957. Both arguments rested on the same core observation, a passage in the Han Shu describing the Battle of Carrhae in 36 BC that included a reference to infantry fighting in a formation resembling fish scales. Dobbs, reading this a continent and 2,000 years removed from the men who wrote it, recognized something else entirely, the testudo, the Roman tortoise formation, shields interlocked overhead and on every flank, a tactic so distinctively Roman that no other ancient Eurasian army is reliably recorded using anything quite like it. From that single image, Dobbs built an entire migration. To appreciate both the appeal and the problems with Dobbs's argument, you need to understand the world the Han Shu was describing, because it was a genuinely complicated world, full of interconnected powers, and the clarity of the narrative Dobbs constructed depends on a simplicity that the actual political landscape of Central Asia in the mid-1st century BC did not possess. The Xiongnu were a confederation of nomadic pastoral peoples who dominated the steppes north of China for roughly 2 centuries, from around the 3rd century BC to their eventual dissolution under sustained Han military pressure in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. At their height under a great leader, they called the Chanyu, they commanded a territory stretching from Manchuria to Central Asia, and they were the primary strategic threat the Han dynasty faced throughout most of the Western Han period. Defeating or neutralizing the Xiongnu was the central military preoccupation of Han Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC, and oversaw the campaigns that opened the Silk Road by pushing Chinese military power westward into the Hexi Corridor and beyond. By the mid-1st century BC, the Xiongnu Confederation had begun to fracture under the pressure of these campaigns and internal succession disputes. The civil war that developed around 60 BC eventually produced 2 rival power centers, the southern Xiongnu under a leader named Hu Hanye, who chose submission to Han suzerainty, and the northern Xiongnu under his older brother, who bore the title Zhiji Chanyu. Zhiji initially held his own against Han pressure, but as his brother's position strengthened with Han backing, Zhiji found himself increasingly marginalized. His response was to move west. Around 44 BC, retreating through successive steppe territories, Zhiji allied with the Kangju people, a Central Asian nomadic group who controlled territory in modern southern Kazakhstan, and eventually built a fortified capital near what is now the city of Taraz in Kazakhstan, on the Talas River. This was extraordinary geography for a Xiongnu leader. Thousands of miles from the Mongolian heartland, deep in territory that sat at the junction of multiple civilizational contact zones, Parthian influence to the southwest, Sogdian merchant networks threading through the valleys, Daoyan remnants to the south, and to the east, the long arm of Han military reach. The mercenary soldiers who served Zhiji came from across this entire zone. Central Asian armies regularly incorporated fighters from far outside their own ethnic and linguistic communities, because the specialized skills of good infantry, good archers, or good cavalry commanders were valuable regardless of where those skills had been acquired. The fish scale formation, whatever its specific origin, was not necessarily exotic in this world. It was merely effective, and effectiveness was the only credential the steppe mercenary market cared about. To understand the world the theory deposits its Romans into, you need to understand what the Han dynasty was doing in Central Asia during the century around the Battle of Zhiji, because it was doing something genuinely extraordinary. Emperor Wu, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC, had inherited a China that was essentially penned in along its northern and western frontiers by Xiongnu military power, paying tribute in silk and grain to buy a precarious peace. He launched the counterattack that changed this, beginning with a series of campaigns in 133 BC that pushed Han military power northward and westward in operations that involved hundreds of thousands of troops and reshaped the political geography of Central Asia. The key strategic asset was the Hexi Corridor, the narrow strip of irrigated land between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north, running roughly 500 miles westward from the Yellow River Bend to the edge of the Tarim Basin. Whoever controlled the Hexi Corridor controlled the only practical land route between China and Central Asia. Emperor Wu seized it from the Xiongnu in a series of campaigns in 121 BC under the young general Huo Qubing, who died at 24, having already conducted some of the most aggressive cavalry operations in Chinese military history, and then consolidated the conquest by establishing 4 new commanderies along its length: Juquan, Zhang Yi, Dunhuang, and Wuwei. These were not merely military outposts, they were administrative foundations for a Chinese presence that would persist for centuries. The Protectorate of the Western Regions, established in 60 BC, was the administrative apparatus that managed Han relationships with the oasis kingdoms of the Tarim Basin and the nomadic peoples of the surrounding steppes. The Protector General commanded from a headquarters in the Tarim Basin and served as Han China's primary diplomatic and military representative in an immense arc of territory stretching from eastern Xinjiang to the Fergana Valley. The man who commanded the assault on Ziji's fortress, Gansu, held this position. His unauthorized subordinate Chen Tang, who actually planned and executed the campaign, was arguably acting in the long tradition of Han frontier generals who took initiative that would have been impossible to authorize through the slow machinery of imperial communication across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. The forged edict was a practical solution to a practical problem. Getting permission from an emperor in Chang'an to conduct a campaign on the other side of the Tarim Basin would have taken weeks or months, by which time the opportunity to strike might have passed. The frontier that this system operated on was not the clean line that maps tend to suggest. It was a zone of overlapping claims, fluid loyalties, and continuous negotiation. The same steppe peoples who might be allies in one season could be enemies in the next, depending on which way the winds of tribute and military pressure were blowing. This is the context that the Lycian legend requires us to ignore. Not a terra incognita where Roman soldiers would have stood out as impossibly exotic, but a zone of such thorough military and commercial mixing that a group of well-trained infantry, using a distinctive shield formation, might have had any number of origins. And the Chinese general recording the battle had no particular reason to identify them more precisely than he did. The general credited with the victory at Zizi was Chen Tang, serving under the nominal command of Gansu. Their campaign was an extraordinary gamble. When Gansu hesitated to authorize an attack on Zizi's fortified camp near what is now Taraz, Chen Tang reportedly forged an imperial edict in his superior's name to mobilize the roughly 40,000 Han and allied troops needed for the assault. Without the emperor's actual permission, a decision that could easily have ended his career or his life, regardless of the outcome, it didn't. The Han force besieged Zizi's fortress, broke through its defences, and in the fighting recorded in Chen Tang's own report to the throne, killed an estimated 1,518 of the defenders, captured 145, and accepted the surrender of more than 1,000 others. Zizi himself was killed and decapitated, his head carried back to the Han capital at Chang'an, and displayed on the city wall for 10 days, the only Xiongnu Chanyu the Han dynasty ever killed in battle. The march to Jiju's fortress was its own ordeal before a single shield was raised. Crossing Kangju territory, the Han column was ambushed by several thousand Kangju cavalrymen returning from a raid on a neighbouring people, who made off with a sizable share of the army's supplies before Chen Tang's allied troops drove them off. Defectors among the Kangju nobility, apparently unhappy with their own alliance to Zizi, switched sides afterward and guided the Han force the rest of the way. A reminder that the steppe's political loyalties in this period ran considerably more fluid than any single empire's chronicle tends to admit. When the Han army finally reached the fortress and began constructing siege works, the defenders sallied out to disrupt the work. Several hundred armoured cavalry, backed by the infantry unit in its now famous formation, all of it beaten back by Han crossbow fire before the defenders could do any real damage. That night, a portion of the garrison tried to slip away under cover of darkness and lost still more men to the besiegers waiting outside. The following day's frontal assault failed to burn through the gate, forcing Chen Tang to settle in for a fuller encirclement instead. A siege won in the end through patience and superior firepower, rather than any single decisive stroke. Within that report sits the detail Dubs built his theory on. A description, by Chen Tang, of more than 100 infantrymen fighting in a formation his account likens to the overlapping pattern of fish scales. And here is where a separate strand of speculation, distinct from Dubs's own, offers an alternative that has never received the attention it deserves. The Hellenistic kingdom of Dayuan, in the Fergana Valley of modern Uzbekistan, had absorbed Greek military colonists in the wake of Alexander's conquests 3 centuries earlier. Dayuan is one of the more remarkable entities in the history of Central Asia. The Fergana Valley, fertile and strategically positioned between the Great Mountain Ranges and the northern steppe, had attracted Greek settlement under Alexander the Great from 329 BC onward. When Alexander founded the city, he called Alexandria Escate, Alexandria the farthest, the most distant of his many Alexandrias. He settled the city with Macedonian veterans unfit for further campaigning and local volunteers, building walls with a perimeter of 6 kilometers and intending it as a base for future expeditions. The Greek colonists and their descendants persisted in the Fergana Valley through the Seleucid period and into the Greco-Bactrian kingdom that replaced it, maintaining elements of Hellenistic culture, urban planning, wine production, certain military practices, for centuries. By the time of the Han Shu's composition, the Chinese records described the people of Dayuan as urbanized dwellers with European features, living in walled cities, and possessing customs identical to those of the Daxia, the Greco-Bactrians. Their connection to the Greek world was culturally alive enough to be visible to Chinese observers 2 centuries after Alexander's death. Soldiers with Hellenistic military training, including shield wall tactics descended from the Greek hoplite tradition, were a known quantity in the Central Asian mercenary market from at least the 3rd century BC. They had been fighting as hired infantry across the region for generations before the Battle of Carrhae ever took place. The alternative theory runs like this. The fish scale formation had nothing to do with Rome. It was a Hellenistic infantry tactic, deployed by Greek-descended soldiers from Dayuan or from the broader pool of Greek-trained mercenaries operating in Central Asia, who found service with Carrhae's forces through the same trade networks that had connected the steppe world to Hellenistic armies for 3 centuries. This alternative deserves real weight precisely because it solves the same puzzle the Lycian legend tries to solve, without requiring 10,000 prisoners to survive an unrecorded, multi-thousand-mile march first. Imagine you're a soldier of the 14th Legion, and it is the autumn after Carrhae, and you are still alive, which by now feels less like luck and more like an oversight someone forgot to correct. Your sandals gave out somewhere past the Oxus. You wear a tunic stitched from felt, traded off a Sogdian merchant, and underneath it your skin has gone the colour of the road. The men marching beside you are not Romans anymore. Not really, they are Parthians who feed you, and Xiongnu who pay you, and a chain of employers so long you've stopped expecting any of them to be the last. At night, when the cooking fires burn low, you sometimes catch yourself reaching for Latin words that no longer come easily, a verb tense, a particular insult, the exact cadence of a centurion barking orders on a parade ground that doesn't exist anymore in any form you'd recognize. The men around your fire speak in 3 or 4 languages, none of them yours by birth, and you have learned enough of each to eat, to march, to avoid the kind of trouble that gets a man left behind. You do not think of yourself anymore as a Roman soldier, so much as a soldier, full stop. A trade you happen to still be alive to practice, regardless of which banner currently pays for it. You do not know the word Lycian. You will never hear it. You know the names of rivers that no map back in Italy has ever recorded. And you know the particular ache of a winter wind coming off a steppe with nothing standing between you and it for 100 miles. Somewhere behind you, in a city you'll never see again, your name is etched on a casualty list nobody bothers to read anymore. Somewhere ahead of you is a battle you don't yet know the name of, fought for a cause that has nothing to do with Rome, in a formation your training built into your hands before you ever knew there'd be a use for it this far from home. You raise your shield. The man beside you raises his. The wall locks into place the way it always has, scale over scale, and for one more day it holds. Whether that wall belonged to a Roman, a half-Roman, a hired sword who'd simply watched enough Roman soldiers to copy the trick, or no one connected to Rome at all, the record does not say, and never will. But somewhere in that uncertainty stands a real man, cold and far from anything he once called home, whose actual story is smaller and stranger and more human than any legend that later grew up around his shield. There is another dimension to this imagined soldier's life that tends to drop out of the romantic version of the story. Boredom, bureaucratic indignity, the sheer administrative mundanity of captivity. The Parthian system that resettled prisoners at Merv was not interested in the men's inner lives or their identities. It was interested in their bodies as labour units, and their combat training as a useful resource. They would have been assigned to garrison duties, given modest rations, permitted to form relationships with local women, because that was how resettlement populations stabilised themselves. They would have been subject to the same petty authority and institutional grinding down that soldiers always face, just in a language they didn't fully understand, under a command structure whose internal politics were opaque to them. The men who retained any coherent Roman military identity after 17 years of this would have been extraordinary. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm saying it requires those men to have been significantly unusual, and the historical record gives us no particular reason to believe they were. For decades, Dubb's theory lived almost entirely inside that architecture, debated by sinologists, largely ignored by everyone else. Then, genetics entered the conversation, and the story stopped being an academic footnote, and became, briefly, international news. The shift began in earnest in the 2000s, when researchers, intrigued by the same physical traits journalists had been photographing throughout the 1990s, organized formal DNA testing among Liqian villagers. One resident in particular, a farmer and sometime construction worker named Luo Ying, deep-set eyes, a prominently hooked nose, features that had earned him local notoriety as one of the village's most visibly Roman faces, travelled to Beijing in 2006 for testing arranged by the Institute of Archaeology under the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. The early read on his individual results, reported at 46% Caucasian ancestry by his own genetic markers, travelled through international press with exactly the kind of certainty the underlying science didn't yet support. British tabloids ran with it eagerly. By 2010, outlets including the Daily Mail were reporting, in language considerably more confident than any peer-reviewed study had yet offered. The DNA testing had confirmed the Liqian villagers as descendants of Roman mercenaries who'd fought the Han dynasty 2,000 years earlier. Chinese state media, having helped launch the legend back in 1993, continued amplifying it. Local Gansu officials, watching a struggling rural county suddenly become a subject of worldwide fascination, didn't exactly rush to correct the record either. This is, I think, a useful moment for the narrator's own honest read on the evidence rather than a flat recitation of competing claims. A single individual's elevated ancestry percentage, isolated from any rigorous population-level study and stripped of the methodological caveats that should have accompanied it from the start, was never sufficient grounds for a headline that, confident, genetics done carelessly, or reported carelessly, can manufacture certainty that the underlying data was never built to support. And that is almost exactly what happened here, for the better part of a decade, before the actual population-wide study caught up with the story the newspapers had already told. Luo Ying himself grew uneasy with the attention well before the scientific picture fully resolved. He eventually began declining interview requests altogether, telling at least one reporter he simply didn't want the disruption to threaten a job he depended on. Behind every viral headline about ancestry and identity sits an actual person whose face became a symbol before anyone asked whether he wanted the role at all. The villager, Kai Jianyan, had been living with this for even longer. His green eyes and aquiline nose had been the visual shorthand for the story since the 1990s, when Chinese state media first brought international journalists to Yongchang's doorstep. He sat for photographers from European and American outlets through the better part of a decade. A face matching the story needed a face for, never having sought the role, and apparently never quite sure how to refuse it. That fuller study arrived in 2007, conducted by a team of Chinese geneticists, and published in the Journal of Human Genetics, and it told a considerably less romantic story than the one already circulating in the press. Researchers analysed Y chromosome markers, genetic material passed down specifically along the paternal line, making it especially useful for testing claims about a male line military ancestry. From 227 men across 4 separate Chinese populations, Liqian villages included, examining 12 short tandem repeat loci and 12 additional genetic markers to map ancestry with far more precision than a single individual's results could ever offer. The conclusion: 77% of Liqian Y chromosomes were restricted entirely to East Asian lineages. Principal component analysis showed the Liqian population clustering tightly with other Han Chinese groups and diverging sharply from Central Asian and Western Eurasian populations of the kind a genuine Roman or Mediterranean ancestral contribution would have left behind. A Roman mercenary origin, the researchers wrote, could not be accepted as true on the basis of paternal genetic variation. A 2008 study by Lanzhou University, testing 87 villagers directly, reached a broadly similar conclusion. Only 3 of the 87 showed genetic markers consistent with West Asian descent, and none showed the specifically Mediterranean or Southwestern European markers that Roman ancestry would be expected to leave. These were West Asian markers, not West European ones, which might reflect, in those 3 individuals, the centuries of Silk Road contact with Sogdian and other Central Asian traders that the mainstream explanation for the region's genetic variation already accounts for perfectly well. Historians weighed in alongside the geneticists, and not gently. Maurizio Bettini An anthropologist at the University of Siena stated that without physical artifacts of unambiguously Roman manufacture, coinage, weapons, military equipment of a type a wandering legionary detachment would necessarily have carried and eventually discarded or buried, the entire story remained no more than a legend, however appealing one. No such artifacts have ever been recovered from the Lycian region. Zhang Sushan from Tsinghua University added a point the physical archaeologists had also been making. Historical records indicate that Han army captives were dispatched to regions in Central Asia, not to the Chinese mainland. The claim that Roman soldiers would have been resettled inside Han territory itself, rather than in a frontier zone, runs against standard Han administrative practice for dealing with prisoners of foreign origin. This is the place where I'll offer a direct, conviction-backed reading, rather than simply laying competing claims side by side. The genetic case against the Lycian legend isn't a matter of one study versus another, equally weighted. It's a population-scale dataset against a single battlefield description filtered through one scholar's interpretive leap. And on that uneven footing, the genetics should be treated as close to decisive. The fish scale formation is suggestive, it was never sufficient, and the DNA evidence for anyone willing to actually sit with the sample size and the methodology closes the door the press cycle had left invitingly open. One of the most intellectually honest questions you can ask about the Lycian legend is not, what evidence supports it, but what evidence should exist if it were true, and why isn't it there? A genuine Roman military settlement in Han China, even a small one, even of 145 men, would have left traces. This is not a matter of historical optimism. It is a matter of understanding what soldiers carry with them and what they leave behind. Roman soldiers in the 1st century BC were equipped with standardized military hardware: the pilum, the heavy javelin, the gladius, the short stabbing sword, the large rectangular scutum shield, hobnailed military sandals called caligae that left a distinctive archaeological signature wherever they marched in numbers. They carried small personal items, coins, fibulae, personal religious objects that survive in the archaeological record with remarkable consistency wherever Roman soldiers went. None of these things have been found at Lycian. Not one coin, not one fragment of Roman military metalwork, not one piece of distinctive Roman pottery, not one caliga hobnail. The absence of physical evidence is not, by itself, proof of absence. Small settlements over 2,000 years can be thoroughly destroyed by subsequent construction, flood, erosion, or simple time. But the scale of the absence across systematic archaeological surveys of a region that has been specifically searched for Roman traces is striking. When Roman soldiers were genuinely present somewhere, they leave behind physical evidence at a remarkable rate. The entire discipline of Roman frontier archaeology in Britain, Germany, the Danube provinces, the Eastern Mediterranean, and North Africa depends on exactly this reliability. Even small Roman military outposts, garrisons of 50 or 100 men in Britain or Germany, leave behind coins, metalwork, pottery, building foundations with distinctively Roman construction techniques and inscriptions. A settlement at the far western edge of the Han Empire, established by a group of soldiers who had been carrying Roman military equipment and who had lived in a Roman military system for their entire adult lives, should have left something. The archaeology says it left nothing. What the archaeology has found, consistently, is evidence of what was actually there. Han dynasty administrative infrastructure, pottery consistent with standard Han frontier settlement patterns, evidence of the multicultural frontier garrison population that Han records themselves acknowledge was present. Not Roman. Han Chinese, with the normal mix of Central Asian and steppe-adjacent influences that the Hexi corridor has always carried. Here is what the genetic evidence and the archaeological silence together actually point toward. And it is, when you look at it clearly, its own kind of remarkable story. The Hexi corridor, the stretch of territory running along the northern edge of the Tibetan plateau that connects China's western interior to Central Asia, was not merely a trade route in the ancient world. It was a zone of sustained human contact, spanning centuries, populated by a rotating cast of peoples, cultures, and genetic backgrounds that no single empire's narrative has ever adequately captured. The Sogdians were here from at least the 1st century BC, establishing trading communities that would persist through the Tang dynasty and beyond. The Yuezhi passed through heading west in the 2nd century BC, eventually becoming the Kushan Empire. Kangju peoples, Wusun peoples, fragments of Scythian groups, remnants of Dayuan settlers, the corridor was continuously populated by people moving, mixing, and putting down roots. The Sogdians in particular deserve to sit at the centre of this picture. They were, in the period from roughly 100 BC to 700 AD, the dominant commercial culture across the entire zone between the Mediterranean world and China. Sogdiana was centred in what is now Uzbekistan, roughly the territory of ancient Samarkand and Bukhara, and Sogdian merchants established diaspora communities across Central Asia and into China itself, forming enduring trading colonies that survived for generations. 2025 genetic study, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, examining ancient DNA from Sogdian burials in Tang dynasty Gansu, found exactly what you'd expect from this history. Individuals with mixed Central and East Asian ancestry, reflecting the intermarriage and cultural assimilation the Sogdians systematically practiced as a way of integrating into local commercial networks while maintaining their trans-regional ties. Wang Shouquan, a Chinese historian who examined the Liqian evidence in detail, pointed out that the Xiongnu Confederation itself was genetically diverse, including Caucasian, Mongolian, and East Asian individuals within the same grouping. The striking physical features of some Yongchang residents might reflect Xiongnu ancestry, not Roman ancestry, and the distinction would be entirely invisible to the journalists who photographed them as proof of Rome's reach. Caucasian-looking features in Gansu are not unique to Yongchang, and they are not unique to any single immigration event. They are the normal background of genetic variation in a region that has been a contact zone for at least 3,000 years. A 2014 genetic study of populations across the Silk Road corridor, published in BMC Genomic Data, found exactly this pattern: a western to eastern gradient of genetic ancestry across Central Asia, with European and West Asian genetic components mixed with East Asian components throughout the region, and a pattern of diffuse admixture that reflected continuous exchange rather than any single founding event. The study's authors found a contribution of up to 50% from Europe and Asia to most of the populations analysed, which is precisely the kind of genetic signature that ordinary centuries-long contact along a major trade corridor produces, with no dramatic single event required to explain it. There is a pattern worth identifying before we close, because the Liqian legend is not unique. It belongs to a recognisable genre of historical imagination that appears across multiple cultures and multiple centuries. The legend of the lost army that didn't actually vanish, but kept going further than anyone knew. The most directly comparable example is the story of the 10,000, the Greek mercenary force that served the Persian pretender Cyrus the Younger in 401 BC, and found themselves, after Cyrus died at the Battle of Carrhae, stranded deep in Persian territory with no obvious route home. Their march back to the Black Sea coast, recorded by the Athenian officer Xenophon in his Anabasis, is one of the foundational adventure narratives of Western literature. Subsequent generations have wanted to extend and continue it, placing descendants of the 10,000 in various corners of the ancient world where Greek features and tactics seem to appear unexpectedly. The Dayuan people of the Fergana Valley, with their Hellenistic city building and their soldiers trained in Greek military methods, were partly the product of this same dynamic. Real Hellenistic colonists who settled in Central Asia and whose descendants persisted there for centuries. The British Empire produced its own versions of these lost army legends. The legend of a missing tribe of Israelites in Kashmir, Welsh-speaking Native Americans in the American interior supposedly descended from a 12th century Welsh prince. None of these stories has survived serious scrutiny. All of them responded to a real cultural need, the desire to find one's own civilization inscribed in places that seemed impossibly remote, to discover that the human past was even more interconnected than the official record suggested. There is something genuinely profound underneath this impulse, even when its specific expressions are historically untenable. The ancient world was, in fact, more connected than any single civilization's records tend to show. The Silk Road moved not only silk and glass and spice, but ideas, techniques, languages, genes, and diseases across distances that the literate classes of Rome and China would have found almost incomprehensible if stated plainly. The problem isn't that people want to believe the world was connected. The world was connected, genuinely and deeply. The problem is the desire to credit that connection to a single dramatic event, a specific army or expedition or diplomatic mission, rather than to the slow, undramatic, largely unrecorded movement of ordinary people doing ordinary things across an extraordinarily large canvas. The Lycian legend says, in essence, these two great civilizations must have touched more than the records show, and here is the touching. The evidence says, more quietly, they did touch more than the records show, but not like this. Not a lost legion, 1,000 ordinary journeys, none of them famous, leaving only a handful of unexpected eyes in a windswept county to mark that the touching ever happened. None of which explains why, knowing all of this, the legend keeps finding new audiences 70 years after Dubs first stood up in London and proposed it. Part of the answer is structural. This is, fundamentally, a story about two of history's most consequential empires reaching toward each other across an impossible distance, and almost touching 2,000 years before any verified direct contact actually occurred. There's something the imagination can't quite let go of in a near miss that close, that tantalising, sitting just beyond what the evidence can actually confirm. Rome and China were, in a real sense, mirror images of each other in the 1st century BC. Both were unified empires that had fought their way to dominance from small, geographically constrained origins. Both relied on professional armies and sophisticated administrative bureaucracies to hold vast territories. Both produced literary and philosophical cultures that considered themselves the centre and summit of the known world, with only vague awareness of what lay beyond their own horizons. The Silk Road that connected them indirectly. Chinese silk travelling west toward Roman markets, and Roman glass travelling east toward Han luxury consumers, was already well established by the time of Carrhae, and both empires knew of the other's existence in the same way you might know of a distant mountain range. Real, significant, imprecisely understood. There's also something specific happening at the edges of empires generally, which this story captures, even if its particular details don't survive scrutiny. Frontiers have always been where the official story of a civilization, clean borders, distinct peoples, a single unbroken bloodline running back to some founding moment, comes apart against the messier reality of trade routes, intermarriage, migration, and contact zones that never respected anyone's tidy map. Lycian sits exactly on that kind of edge, geographically and culturally, and the legend that grew up around it says less, in the end, about Roman soldiers than about how badly both Chinese and Western audiences wanted a frontier village to be a secret thread connecting their two civilizations. The legend has, by now, outgrown the village entirely and taken on a cultural life of its own. Chinese television dramas have dramatized versions of the story for general audiences who will never set foot in Gansu. A 2015 Jackie Chan film called Dragon Blade staged a version of the encounter between Roman soldiers and Han armies that turned the theory into outright action cinema. None of this is evidence of anything beyond what a good story can do once it's loose in the world. And there is a simpler psychological explanation too, sitting underneath the cultural one. A green-eyed child born in a beige, wine-swept county in Gansu province is, by any account, a striking thing to encounter. And your ancestors marched with the Caesars is a vastly more satisfying explanation than background genetic variation, possibly compounded by limited later contact along Silk Road trade networks, expressed unevenly across an isolated population. One of those stories gives a person a place in world history. The other gives them a footnote about statistical drift. It isn't difficult to understand which one a village, or a journalist, or a tourism board would rather tell. Whatever the genetics ultimately say, Lycian has not waited for academic consensus to decide what kind of place it wants to be. Long before the 2007 study results filtered down to local awareness, the village, officially renamed Lycian in 1999, a decade into the tourist interest, had already built a Roman-style pavilion at its entrance, complete with a Doric column meant to evoke classical architecture. Statues of legionaries in plate and helmet now stand along its main approach. The county capital of Yongchang decorated its main thoroughfare with statues of a Roman legionary standing next to a Confucian scholar and a Muslim woman, intended as a symbol of racial harmony. a distinctly contemporary political framing applied to a legend whose own relationship to evidence was always complicated. By 2007, the Gansu provincial government had published a picture book titled The Lost Roman Legion, featuring 150 images of local historical sites and customs, presenting the Roman origin story as established regional heritage. In 2012, Yongchang County erected a monument commemorating what it called the eastward journey of the Roman legion, 5 years after the genetic study that had quietly closed the case. The restored Liqian ancient city, built as a heritage tourism attraction, features golden vaults, Latin crosses rendered in stained glass, and bronze doors carved with images of Roman figures alongside Chinese bodhisattvas. A hybrid aesthetic that says more about contemporary imagination than ancient history. An Italian study centre was established at Lonzhou University, with researchers conducting further excavations along this stretch of the Silk Road, specifically in hopes of finding additional evidence, so far without producing the kind of unambiguous Roman artifact that would settle the question definitively. There is something worth sitting with in that asymmetry. The genetic case against a Roman ancestral population is about as strong as population-level Y chromosome studies can typically offer. And still, the tourism infrastructure, the statues, the pavilion, the entire economic and cultural apparatus built around the legend persists largely unchanged, not because anyone involved is being deliberately deceptive, but because a community's identity, once built around a story, doesn't dismantle itself simply because a study said otherwise. Stories, it turns out, are considerably more durable than the evidence underneath them. There's a quieter, sadder thread running underneath the tourist economy too, worth naming honestly. For men like Luo Ying, the legend was never purely abstract. It became, for a while, a livelihood, a reason for outsiders to seek him out, photograph him, ask him questions about an ancestry the geneticists were simultaneously dismantling in journals he likely never read. When the formal results came back unfavourable, the attention thinned considerably, and the men whose faces had once illustrated international headlines went back, mostly to lives the cameras had only briefly interrupted. Which brings us back, as it should, to where we began, to a handful of villages in Yongchang County whose eyes really do carry a colour the genetics of the surrounding region can't easily explain within a single dramatic origin story, whose features really do stand out from their neighbours in ways too consistent to wave away entirely. The honest answer, the one the DNA and the Han Shu and 70 years of careful scholarly argument actually support, is smaller and stranger than the legend in its own way. These traits almost certainly trace to ordinary, centuries-deep genetic exchange along the Silk Road's tangle of trade routes, Sogdian merchants, Central Asian travellers, the kind of low-level, unglamorous, repeated contact that leaves genetic traces precisely because it happened constantly rather than once, dramatically, in a single battle 2,000 years ago. Not a lost legion. A long, slow current of ordinary human movement, the kind history rarely bothers to name because it never produces a single satisfying headline. Picture the actual mechanism behind those green eyes instead of the legionary one, because it's its own kind of quiet wonder. A Sogdian trader passing through a generation before the Han dynasty even existed. A Kangju soldier settling down after one of a dozen forgotten border skirmishes nobody bothered recording in enough detail to survive. A merchant family intermarrying, slowly, invisibly, over 4 or 5 centuries, leaving behind a recessive gene that occasionally, unpredictably, surfaces again in a child born 2,000 years later in a village whose name happens, by pure coincidence, to sound a little like the word for Rome. No drama, no battle. Just time and movement, and the ordinary persistence of human contact across a frontier that was never as sealed as later mapmakers liked to pretend. There is no Roman eagle buried beneath Gansu soil. No legionary's blade waiting in some unexcavated tomb to settle the matter once and for all. What's actually there is quieter and, I'd argue, no less remarkable. A real, demonstrable thread connecting one of the most isolated stretches of inland Asia to a vast network of contact and exchange that genuinely did span much of the ancient world, even if it never ran through Crassus's lost legions specifically. Homer Dubs read a fish scale formation and a coincidental place name and saw Rome. What the evidence more carefully gathered since actually shows is something arguably more remarkable than the legend it replaced. Proof that distant corners of the ancient world were never as cut off from one another as the silence in any single empire's records might suggest. There is one final interpretive point worth making about what the persistence of the legend itself reveals about us. When the Dobbs theory surfaced in 1955, it was taken seriously not only because the evidence was suggestive, but because it answered a cultural need. The need to connect the Western tradition, embodied in Rome, to the oldest and most continuous civilization in human history, embodied in China. The story of the Lost Legion is, at some level, a story about Western civilization wanting to believe that its reach was longer than it actually was, that even its most catastrophic failures ended not in silence, but in some kind of remarkable continuation. That is a recognizable human impulse. It is also, when dressed up as history, a form of wishful thinking, and the better the story fits the wish, the more carefully it deserves to be examined. The villagers of Yongchang County are not, as best as the evidence can presently determine, the descendants of Crassus's lost legions, but they are still the living proof of something real, that history's quietest threads, a trade caravan, a wandering merchant, centuries of small unrecorded contact, can travel just as far as any army and leave just as lasting a mark, even when no chronicle ever thought to write their names down. There is a kind of institutional amnesia that happens to armies after catastrophic defeat, and Carrhae produced one of history's clearest examples of it. Understanding this amnesia is important, because the gap in the Roman record that later became the blank canvas for the Lycian legend was not accidental. It was structural. The Roman military system of the late Republic and early Empire depended on a very specific kind of narrative continuity, the idea that the legions were invincible in principle, whatever their temporary setbacks in practice. Defeats happened, they were acknowledged, but they were acknowledged as exceptional, as products of specific failures of judgment or bad luck, or treacherous enemies, rather than as evidence of systemic vulnerability. The lesson drawn from Carrhae, from Rome's catastrophic loss to Hannibal in 216 BC, was not that Roman tactics were inadequate, but that the Romans had been betrayed by a specific combination of terrain and enemy genius that they would not allow to be repeated. The lesson drawn from Carrhae was similar. Crassus was greedy and rash. He chose the wrong terrain and ignored good advice, and the result was a disaster that reflects on Crassus rather than on the legion as an institution. Within this framing, the prisoners of Carrhae were awkward. 10,000 men in Parthian captivity were living evidence of Roman defeat, and the longer they remained in Parthian hands, the more uncomfortable that evidence became. When they were mentioned at all, which was rarely, it was in the context of diplomatic negotiations, where their return could be framed as a Roman achievement rather than a Roman acknowledgement of vulnerability. When they weren't mentioned, which was most of the time, their absence from the record was partly the standard ancient indifference to ordinary soldiers' fates, and partly something more uncomfortable, a collective preference not to think too carefully about what had happened to them. This is the soil in which the Lycian legend eventually grew. The silence was real, the gap was genuine, and the gap in the record, especially a gap around something as dramatic as a major military catastrophe, is exactly the kind of space that human imagination rushes to fill. Every generation that encountered the story of Carrhae without the story of what came after was, in a sense, invited to imagine its own ending for the men who walked off the map. The Romans themselves occasionally indulged in this kind of speculation. There is a passage in Pliny that suggests someone had heard something about Roman military standards appearing in the East. The precise passage scholars argue about, the one that became the gossamer thread from which much of the subsequent legend dangled. Whether Pliny was reporting a real rumour, an embellished rumour, or a misunderstood second-hand account of something else entirely, is now impossible to determine. What matters is that the gap was known, the silence felt, and the desire to fill it persistent. Roman literature has a recurring preoccupation with the fate of Carrhae's survivors that manifests not as direct historical inquiry, but as anxiety. Horace, writing in the aftermath of the Augustan settlement, produced poems about the shame of Roman captives who had supposedly adapted too well to Parthian ways. Had they married Parthian women? Had they forgotten their Latin? Had they become, in the most Roman sense of the word, lost? These poems were not specifically about Carrhae's prisoners. but they drew on the same cultural anxiety that Carrhae had produced, the horror of Roman soldiers becoming something other than Roman, somewhere beyond the edge of the map. The anxiety is comprehensible. Rome was a civilization built around the concept of pietas, duty, loyalty, the proper relationship between a man and his obligations to family, gods, and state. A soldier who survived captivity and built a new life in a foreign land was not simply unfortunate. He was, from one angle of the Roman moral universe, a man who had failed his duty twice over. First, by being captured at all, and second, by adapting to captivity well enough to stay alive. The men who committed suicide, rather than return to Rome, when Augustus's 20 BC agreement offered them repatriation, were, in this reading, making a statement about their own honour, or about the impossibility of returning to a Rome that would have looked at them with that particular species of Roman contempt reserved for men who had survived when they shouldn't have. It is worth spending more time with the fish scale formation itself, not because it ultimately proves the Roman theory, but because it is the only specific, datable, independently documented piece of evidence the entire legend rests on, and the more carefully you examine it, the more ambiguous it becomes. The Chinese term yulin zhen, rendered in English as fish scale formation, describes a specific visual quality. Overlapping elements arranged like the scales of a fish, each one covering part of the one below and being covered by the one above. Applied to shields, this describes any sufficiently disciplined defensive infantry formation where shields are held in overlapping positions to create a more continuous protective barrier than individual shields held independently could provide. The Roman testudo is the most famous implementation of this principle. It is not the only one. Greek hoplites fighting in close phalanx formation presented overlapping shields. The distinctive hoplon, the large round shield that gave the hoplite his name, was specifically designed to cover not only the bearer's left side, but also the right side of the man to his left, creating precisely the interlocking, overlapping pattern that the Chinese terminology describes. This is one of the reasons the Daiyuan alternative theory has real scholarly legs. Greek, hoplite-descended soldiers, operating in Central Asia from bases that had maintained Hellenistic military traditions for 3 centuries, would have trained in exactly this kind of formation. A Chinese general who had never encountered Greek infantry before would have described what he saw in exactly the terms the Han Shu uses, overlapping, like fish scales, without any reference to Rome being necessary at all. There is also a third possibility that tends to get overlooked in discussions that frame this as a Roman versus Daiyuan debate. The formation might have been locally developed. Military technology transfers quickly across the ancient world, and the steppe mercenary market was particularly efficient at spreading effective tactical innovations across cultural boundaries. A unit of Xiongnu or Kangju infantry that had encountered Greek or Roman shield formation tactics in any of the dozens of border conflicts and mercenary engagements of the previous century might have adopted and adapted those tactics independently. A borrowed tactical innovation, passed through several generations of steppe warfare, is not the same thing as a direct connection to the army that originally developed it. Chen Tang's report to the emperor, which is the source of the fish scale detail, was not a dispassionate military analysis. It was a report to an emperor from a general who had committed insubordination on a massive scale, forging an imperial edict, mobilizing 40,000 troops, and marching into territory far beyond his authorized operational area, and who needed to make the case that the victory justified the means. Chen Tang had every incentive to make the battle sound as dramatic and as significant as possible. The unusual formation of a few hundred infantry might have been worth mentioning precisely because it added colour to a report that needed to impress a skeptical imperial court. How much weight should we give to a detail recorded by a man with a strong personal interest in making his unauthorized campaign sound as impressive as possible? The Han Shu is not uncritical of Chen Tang. It records his insubordination plainly and notes that the verdict on his conduct was contested in the imperial court afterward. His report should be read as a document with an agenda, like most military dispatches from all cultures and all periods. The absence of Roman artifacts from Lycian deserves more than a passing mention, because the archaeological argument against the Roman theory is, in some ways, the strongest single piece of evidence available, stronger even than the genetics, because it is immune to the methodological objections that can always be raised about population sampling and reference populations. Consider what a group of Roman soldiers would have been carrying in 36 BC, if they had survived 17 years of steppe warfare and were now fighting for a Xiongnu chieftain at the edge of the Chinese Empire. Their original military equipment, the standardized kit that the Roman army issued to every legionary, would have been largely lost, damaged, or traded away by this point, 17 years into their captivity. But individuals accumulate possessions over 17 years. They would have acquired whatever weapons their various employers provided. They would have carried personal items, coins saved from military service, small votive objects, or personal religious items, perhaps rings or fibulae in distinctively Roman styles. If any of them had maintained any connection to their Roman identity, there would be traces of it in the archaeological record. None of these things appear at Liqian or anywhere in the Yongchang County archaeological record. The absence is not merely of large, obvious artifacts like legionary eagles or inscribed tombstones. It is the absence of even the small, personal, easily overlooked category of finds that Romano provincial sites produce in abundance. A Roman coin found in China is not necessarily evidence of Roman military presence. Coins travel along trade routes. But the total absence of any Roman period artifact at a site supposedly settled by Roman soldiers is significant. The Silk Road trade routes did reach China in this period. Roman glass and metalwork appear in Chinese archaeological contexts at various sites along the trade corridor. None of it appears at Liqian. The Lanzhou University researchers who conducted excavations specifically motivated by the Roman origin theory have been forthright about this. Their excavations revealed Han Dynasty artifacts consistent with a normal Han frontier settlement pattern. They found no evidence of Roman material culture. The most generous interpretation of this absence, that the site has been too thoroughly disrupted by later settlement to preserve any Roman period deposits, is possible but must be weighed against the fact that Han period artifacts were recovered. If Han material survived, Roman material, had it ever been there, should have had at least some chance of surviving too. What the physical archaeology actually reveals is the ordinary Han frontier in all its mundane complexity. Pottery consistent with regional production, coins of the type that circulated throughout the Han monetary system, evidence of the standard administrative infrastructure that the Han erected wherever it established permanent control, not exotic, not foreign in any way that defies the normal patterns of the region. Simply Han China doing what Han China did on its frontiers, which was, in the Hexi corridor in this period, both militarily impressive and culturally continuous with the broader Han imperial project. One of the more persistent claims in popular treatments of the Liqian legend is that the very name of the settlement proves a Roman connection, that Liqian is a Chinese rendering of legio, the Latin word for legion, and that the Han bureaucracy would not have named a settlement after a word from a language it had no contact with, unless that language was spoken by the people who lived there. This is a genuinely interesting argument, and Homer Dubs made it with considerable linguistic care. The problems with it are also genuine, and they deserve to be stated clearly. The Chinese name Liqian, written with two characters that can be transliterated in various ways depending on which Romanization system you use, and pronounced in ways that vary across the different Chinese dialects that have existed over 2 millennia, does bear some phonetic resemblance to the Latin legio, when both are rendered through the filter of ancient Chinese phonology. But ancient Chinese phonology is itself a reconstructed field, and the degree of resemblance depends heavily on which reconstruction you use and which period of Chinese phonological development you're anchoring to. Different scholars, working with different reconstructions, have reached different conclusions about how close the resemblance actually is. More importantly, there is a competing and arguably more parsimonious explanation for the name that Dubs was aware of, but treated as less likely than his own. The Chinese used the term Li Jian, a close relative of the name Li Qian, with the same basic phonetic structure, as a general term for the distant Western territories associated with the Hellenistic and Roman world broadly. This usage predates any possible Roman military presence in Gansu by at least a century. It appears in Chinese records describing diplomatic and commercial contacts with the Hellenistic kingdoms of Central Asia, the Daiyuan and Daxia regions, as a generic toponym for the far west, establishing a county called Liqian on the western frontier of the Han Empire might simply have been the Han bureaucracy using an existing toponym to identify a settlement in the western regions, without any specific reference to Rome or Romans at all. Dubs's own translation work was meticulous enough that he was aware of this alternative reading and acknowledged it. He argued that the specific phonetic proximity of Liqian to Legio, rather than to the more generic Western toponyms, suggested a deliberate connection to Rome specifically, but this argument requires a degree of precision in Han bureaucratic phonological borrowing that the rest of the evidence for this period doesn't fully support. The Han were systematic administrators, but they were not systematic in the phonological sense we might want them to be. Place names were established for practical administrative reasons, often with only approximate attention to the sounds of the foreign words they were supposedly rendering. The name, in other words, is suggestive in the way that all the other pieces of evidence in this story are suggestive. It fits. It doesn't prove. There is one last dimension of the Carrhae story worth exploring before we let the desert close over it. What the battle meant not just militarily but philosophically, in a culture that had very specific ideas about the relationship between virtue and success. The Roman moral system, as it was articulated by writers from Cicero to Plutarch, held that genuine excellence of character was supposed to produce success in war, in politics, and in life. A man of true virtue, properly trained and rightly ordered, should be able to navigate the world effectively. Defeat, especially on this scale, raised uncomfortable questions about character. Was Crassus defeated because he was greedy and rash? Or was he greedy and rash because he was the kind of man who would eventually be defeated? The Roman biographical tradition, drawing on Plutarch's lives and Cassius Dio's history, tends to present Carrhae as the inevitable outcome of Crassus's character flaws, which makes the moral arithmetic clean, but papers over the tactical reality, which is that any Roman army sent into open desert against Parthian cavalry in this period would have faced serious problems, regardless of who commanded it. Marcus Antony's 36 BC disaster in Parthia, waged by a man whose personal courage was never in doubt, with forces considerably larger than Crassus had commanded, supports this reading. The Parthian cavalry advantage on open terrain was a genuine structural problem for the Roman army, not merely a symptom of bad Roman character. But the Roman biographical tradition preferred the character explanation because it was morally neater and because it avoided the admission that the Roman military system had a genuine, identifiable weakness that persistence and valour couldn't simply overcome. Crassus became, in the Roman imagination, a cautionary tale about the specific combination of wealth and ambition. His fortune made the story more satisfying to tell. Here was a man so rich, he boasted that no one could call himself wealthy unless he could maintain a legion at his own expense. And he died in a desert, having lost 7 of them, with his head cut off and sent to a king he had underestimated. The symmetry is almost too perfect. Ancient historians tended to read this kind of symmetry as confirmation of moral truths, the punishment fitting the crime, the hubris producing the fall. Modern historians are more likely to note that the Parthian cavalry tactics would have worked equally well against a humble, virtuous, careful Roman general, and that the desert does not care about character. What does all this have to do with the Liqian legend? More than it might appear. The Roman biographical tradition's insistence on reading Carrhae as a story about Crassus specifically, rather than about Roman military limitations generally, is what made the fate of the prisoners so easy to set aside. If the disaster was Crassus's fault, his greed, his rashness, his refusal to listen, then the prisoners were his fault too, an appendage to his tragedy, rather than 10,000 individual human stories worth following to their conclusions. The legend of the Lost Legion is, in part, a correction to this dismissal, an insistence that the ordinary soldiers of Carrhae had lives that extended beyond the moment of their general's failure, that they kept moving and kept living and left marks that the official record chose not to follow. That corrective impulse is sympathetic even when the specific form it takes, Roman soldiers in Gansu, is historically untenable. Which brings us, finally, to the question that sits underneath all the specific debates about fish scale formations and Y chromosome markers and the phonology of ancient Chinese place names. What does it mean that we want this story to be true. The Liqian legend is not unique in being appealing without being true. History is full of such stories. The difference here is the specificity of the appeal and the particular civilizational investments it engages. The story of Roman soldiers ending up in China is not simply a curiosity. It is, for Western audiences, a fantasy about the ultimate reach of the civilization they most frequently trace their own lineage through. And for Chinese audiences, particularly in the context of a China reintegrating itself into a globalized world after the 20th century's long period of enforced insularity, it offers a version of China's history that places the country at the center of the ancient world's most dramatic crossroads, the place where even Rome's most catastrophic failures somehow arrived. The year 1993, when Chinese state media first widely circulated the Liqian story, was 2 years after the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union, and 3 years after Deng Xiaoping's push for China's economic opening. China in 1993 was in the middle of one of the most dramatic economic transformations in human history. In that context, a story about ancient Romans coming to China, about Western civilization seeking out the Chinese frontier, being absorbed into it, leaving traces of itself in Chinese blood and Chinese place names, carried a particular kind of resonance that purely academic discussions of Han Dynasty frontier administration were unlikely to produce. The legend arrived at exactly the right moment to serve exactly the right cultural purpose, regardless of what the genetics said. This is not cynicism. It is simply an acknowledgement that stories about the past are never purely about the past. They are always also about the present, about what we need to believe, about what kind of place in the world we want to inhabit, about how we want to understand the long lines connecting us to everything that came before. The Liqian legend is a story about connection, about the possibility that civilizations we think of as separate were never as separate as we imagined. That desire is entirely legitimate. The particular story constructed to satisfy it just happens to be wrong. The right story, the one the genetics and the archaeology and the careful reading of ancient texts actually tells, is about the same connection, achieved through the same broad zone of human contact across the ancient world. It is achieved more slowly, more quietly, through 10,000 ordinary journeys, rather than one dramatic catastrophe. It is less cinematically satisfying, and considerably harder to tell. But it is, in the end, the connection that actually existed, and that connection was real and vast, and remarkable enough that it left green eyes in a Gansu village 2,000 years after the last trader who carried the relevant genes passed through. That is the story worth telling. It is also the story worth sleeping on. The Silk Road that linked Rome and Han China, if we call it the Silk Road, which is a 19th century coinage that the ancient traders who used it would not have recognized, was not a single road at all. It was a shifting network of routes, some paved and some not, some safe in one season and dangerous in the next, connecting oasis towns across thousands of miles of desert and steppe. Caravans moved along it, carrying silk from China westward, and Roman glass, wool, and gold eastward, changing hands multiple times before either commodity reached its ultimate destination. The people who operated this system were not, primarily, Roman or Chinese. They were Parthians at one end, and Han Chinese at the other, but the middle, the vast, crucial middle, was Sogdian. The Sogdians of ancient Samarkand and Bukhara were the master merchants of the ancient world's most important trade corridor, establishing colonies across Central Asia that persisted for centuries and that served as the primary mechanism by which goods, ideas, and people moved between the Mediterranean and Chinese worlds. A Sogdian merchant in 50 BC operated something like this. He might have started his journey in Samarkand, carrying bolts of silk and packages of spice purchased from Chinese traders at the eastern end of the route. He would have travelled west through the Hexi corridor, past the newly established Han commanderies at Dunhuang and Juquan, through the Tarim Basin oasis kingdoms and into Parthian territory. There, he would have sold his Chinese goods to Parthian merchants, who would carry them the rest of the way to Roman markets in Syria and Egypt. The Sogdian himself might never have reached Rome, and the Roman merchant who ultimately bought the silk might never have reached China. But the silk, and with it, traces of the cultures that produced and consumed it, travelled the entire width of the ancient world in a relay of human hands. The genetic consequences of this system, playing out over 4 or 5 centuries, are exactly what the population genetics of the Hexi corridor shows. A steady, low-level mixing of Western Eurasian and East Asian genetic material, distributed unevenly across the population, producing the occasional surprising recessive trait, a green eye, a lighter hair colour, a nose with a particular bridge, in places far from where those traits are normally common. Not Romans, not Greeks. The ongoing, unremarkable, entirely human consequence of 400 years of Sogdian merchants doing their jobs. This is the real answer to the village with the wrong faces. Not eagles and testudo formations and the ghost of Crassus, the Sogdian merchant network, the Kangju steppe warriors who sometimes married into settled communities, the Wusun tribespeople who occupied the corridor before the Han arrived, the occasional Han-employed foreign garrison soldier from somewhere further west than anyone bothered to record. The ordinary human traffic of the most consequential trade route in the ancient world, leaving its ordinary human traces in faces that look, 2,000 years later, a little like somewhere else. Let that be the last image for tonight. Not a lost legion. Not a dramatic catastrophe generating an impossible journey across the width of the known world. Just a merchant, somewhere in the Hexy corridor, stopping at a settlement to trade, staying long enough to matter, and moving on. His name is not recorded. His face is not photographed. His genes are still here. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever hour the clock shows where you are, let the quietness of that carry you out gently. The old world was connected in ways we are still learning to read. The evidence is written in faces, in pottery shards, in the drift of genes across a continent. Not in legions, in people. Rest well. The road goes quiet now. One of the quiet revelations that comes from reading the scholarship on Carrhae carefully, the Samson, the Bivar, the analysis from the Cambridge History of Iran, is how much of what we think we know about this battle comes from a very small number of sources, each with its own agenda and its own limitations, and how little space any of them give to the men who weren't generals. Plutarch's Life of Crassus is the most detailed account we have, and it was written well over a century after the battle. Plutarch wrote biographies, not military histories. His interest in Carrhae was as a moral story about a man brought low by his own character, and the soldiers of the 7 legions appear in his account primarily as witnesses to Crassus's failure or as objects of Parthian cruelty. The 10,000 captives receive a sentence. Then they disappear from his narrative as completely as they disappeared from the historical record. Cassius Dio's account, written in the early 3rd century AD, nearly 300 years after the battle, is shorter and less vivid than Plutarch's but draws on some of the same tradition of sources, themselves now lost. Dio was interested in the political consequences for Rome, not in what happened to ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. Neither of them was in a position to know what happened to the prisoners, because that story unfolded in Parthian territory, recorded if at all in Parthian administrative documents that have not survived, in a language that Roman historians of the period could not read. The silence is not laziness or indifference. It is a genuine information gap, produced by the fact that the story continued in a place and in languages that the people doing the writing had no access to. Good history requires sitting with uncertainty, acknowledging what is not known, resisting the temptation to construct a satisfying narrative where the sources provide only fragments. The Li Qian legend failed this test in 1957 and has continued to fail it since. Not because the instinct behind it was wrong, but because the execution mistook poetic plausibility for historical evidence. The scholarship of the last 3 decades has substantially revised the older picture of ancient civilizational isolation. The study of the Silk Road's cultural and genetic consequences has revealed a degree of long-distance exchange that would have surprised earlier generations of historians. Ancient DNA studies have documented movements of people across extraordinary distances. The steppe migrations that shaped the genetic history of Europe, the movements of Bronze Age populations across Eurasia, the Sogdian diaspora across Central Asia. The world of antiquity was more mobile, more interconnected, more thoroughly mixed than anyone looking at the surviving literary record would have guessed. In this revised picture, the question is not whether Rome and Han China were connected. They were indirectly but genuinely, but how that connection worked, through what mechanisms, at what speeds, and with what consequences. The answer turns out to be through commerce, through the movement of craftspeople and merchants and mercenaries across the steppe, through the relay system of the Silk Road, in which no single carrier traversed the whole distance but goods and genes and ideas made the journey in stages. Not through a dramatic one-time catastrophe that sent soldiers 4,000 miles in a single arc. Through the ordinary, continuous, largely unrecorded movement of ordinary people across the most consequential geography in the pre-modern world. This answer is better than the Lycian legend, even from the standpoint of what the legend was trying to say. If the goal was to demonstrate that Rome and China were not as separate as conventional wisdom suggested, the actual historical record of sustained Silk Road contact, of Sogdian diaspora communities, of the genetic mixing documented across the corridor, makes a far more powerful case than any lost legion could. The reality of ancient connectivity is bigger and more pervasive than a single army, and it lasted far longer. Here is the last image to carry into sleep, because it seems the right one. It is not a Roman eagle, it is not a formation of shields interlocked in desert light. It is a child, born somewhere in the Hexi corridor in the 2nd or 1st century BC, to parents who had no idea where their own parents had come from, who carried in their blood the accumulated genetic drift of 10 generations of ordinary people, crossing that particular stretch of the world. The child has green eyes. No one in the family has had green eyes in living memory. The parents don't know what to make of it. They are farmers, or merchants, or garrison soldiers at one of the Han frontier outposts. They speak Chinese. They worship Han gods. They are entirely of their place and time, except for one gene that surfaced from some ancestor's encounter with someone from somewhere else. In some generation, no one remembers. 2,000 years later, a journalist photographs that child's descendant and writes a story about lost Roman legions. The descendant is not a Roman. They never were, but they are proof that the world was never as closed as anyone imagined. That human beings have been crossing vast distances, mixing and leaving traces since long before any empire was built to track them. The 10,000 men who walked into the desert at Carrhae are not in Gansu, but they are somewhere. Their genes are distributed now across some population we have not identified and cannot trace. Their story ended not in a village, but in the ordinary dispersal of people who do not have biographers, whose names are not inscribed on any monument, whose genetic legacy is present in some living person who has no idea and no reason to suspect it. That is, finally, the answer the evidence supports. Not Rome in China, but Rome dissolved into the larger flow of human life across the ancient world, becoming something else, somewhere else, in someone else. Carry that into sleep. Not the drama of soldiers and defeats, the quieter truth of an ordinary child with unexpected eyes, on a windswept frontier, 2,000 years from anyone who would understand where those eyes came from. The world has always been bigger and more connected than its official records admit. The green eyes know that, even when the historians don't. Rest well. The road goes quiet now. There is always more to find. Every civilization produces stories about its lost armies. The Romans were particularly good at it. The disaster at the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, where 3 legions, under Publius Quinctilius Varus, were ambushed and destroyed by Germanic tribesmen under Arminius, produced a legend that persisted for generations. Augustus himself reportedly woke from sleep crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The site of the battle was not positively identified by archaeology until 1987, nearly 2,000 years after the event. For those 2,000 years, the battle was known from ancient sources, but its location was a matter of scholarly debate. This comparison is instructive because it shows what the archaeological record can and cannot do. When Roman soldiers were genuinely present somewhere, even in a disastrous ambush in a German forest, they left physical evidence that eventually surfaces. The Teutoburg forest site at Calcresi has produced Roman military equipment, coins, skeletal remains, and artifacts that make the identification unambiguous. The bodies were there. The equipment was there. The evidence is there. Lycian has none of this. Not because the physical evidence has been missed or undiscovered. The site has been specifically searched, specifically because the Roman origin theory motivated the search, but because the physical evidence does not exist to find. This is the most honest reading of the available evidence. Not that we haven't looked hard enough, but that we have looked. and found the ordinary Han frontier settlement, the genetics, and the administrative records both predicted we would find. The Teutoburg comparison also illustrates something about the nature of the evidence gap at Carrhae. The 3 legions lost at Teutoburg are also missing from subsequent Roman records, in the sense that we don't know the fate of every survivor, every prisoner, every individual who walked away from that ambush into Germanic captivity. But we know they were there. The physical record confirms the literary record. For Carrhae, the literary record is clear up to the moment the prisoners walk east, and then nothing. No physical record at any proposed stopping point along their alleged route. Not at Merv, not at any intermediate location, not at Lycian. There is a version of the Lycian story that honest advocates of the Roman theory can tell, and should tell if they want to be taken seriously, that acknowledges the weight of the evidence against, while still holding open the possibility that the theory contains a kernel of truth. That version would go something like this. The genetics show that the modern population of Lycian is overwhelmingly of Han Chinese descent, and that no detectable Roman-specific genetic contribution is present. The archaeology shows no Roman material culture at the site. The Hanshu does not identify the fish scale formation users as Romans or even as Westerners. The etymology of Lycian is consistent with standard Han usage of Western toponyms. All of this is true, and all of it weighs against the theory, but absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, and there is a non-zero probability that a small number of Roman or Roman-descended individuals contributed genetic material to the Lycian population 2,000 years ago that has since been diluted beyond detection by intermarriage with the surrounding Han majority. The fish scale formation might have been used by such individuals without their origin being noted. The name Lycian might carry a faint echo of a Roman connection alongside its more standard topographic meaning. This is the most that the honest version of the theory can claim, a small possibility that cannot be definitively ruled out by the available evidence, not proof, not probability, a small remaining space of uncertainty in which the romantic reading can, if it chooses, continue to reside. Most people who tell the Lycian story don't tell this version. They tell a version in which the uncertainty is much larger, in which the positive evidence is more substantial, and in which the genetic and archaeological evidence against the theory is minimized or ignored. Understanding the difference between these two versions, between the honest statement of a small remaining uncertainty and the confident assertion of an established truth, is, I think, the most important lesson the Lycian legend has to teach about how historical evidence works and how it can be misread. Homer Dubs deserves, in the final accounting, a kind of double respect. He was wrong about Lycian, but he was wrong in an interesting way. Wrong because he was too imaginative, too willing to construct a coherent narrative from fragmentary evidence, not because he was careless or dishonest. His translation work on the Hanshu remains valuable. His eye for the unusual detail in a Chinese military chronicle, the fish scale formation, the place name, the suggestive resonance between events 17 years apart in very different parts of the world, was genuine scholarly attention, the kind that produces discoveries as well as theories. What failed him was the leap from suggestive to demonstrated, from possibly to probably, from interesting parallel to established fact. Every historian faces this temptation, because the work of historical reconstruction requires imagination as well as evidence, and the imagination is always running slightly ahead of what the evidence can support. The discipline is in knowing when to stop, when to say the evidence suggests, rather than the evidence shows, when to present a possibility rather than a conclusion. Dubs crossed that line, and the legend he inadvertently created crossed it much further in subsequent popular retellings. But the impulse behind his work, to look for connections across civilizational boundaries, to take seriously the evidence that the ancient world was more interconnected than the official records suggest, to follow a thin thread to see where it leads. That impulse is one of the most valuable in historical scholarship. It just needs to be held alongside the equally valuable impulse to check the thread's strength before trusting it to bear weight. These two impulses together, in balance, are what good historical thinking looks like. The Lycian legend is a case study in what happens when the first operates without the second. There is something worth naming about the experience of carrying an unresolved question into sleep, because it is different from carrying a resolved one. A resolved question settles, it closes, it gives you somewhere to put the story you have just heard. a shelf in the mind where things are filed and finished. An unresolved question does something stranger. It keeps opening. It turns quietly in the dark, surfacing details in a different order, trying combinations the waking mind did not think to try. Some people find this uncomfortable. Others find it the most natural state imaginable, the mind doing in the hours of sleep what the day did not quite have time for. The Liqian question is a particularly good one to fall asleep with because it is unresolved in the most honest possible sense. Not unresolved because the evidence is thin. The evidence, read carefully, points fairly clearly toward the answer being no. There were no Roman soldiers in Gansu. Unresolved because the human desire that generated the question is entirely legitimate, and that desire does not stop being legitimate just because the specific story it latched onto turned out not to be true. What happened to the 10,000 men? They dispersed, they died, or adapted, or moved, in the individual ways that people do when the institution they belong to stops existing and the world they are left in requires different things of them. Their genetic material is somewhere in the human population today, mixed into the broader ancestry of Central Asia in proportions too small to locate. Their Latin is gone. Their military formations are gone. The eagles they carried are in a museum in Rome, recovered through diplomacy 33 years after the battle that lost them. What remains is the question itself, patient, persistent, returning in every generation to the same gap in the record and asking the same thing. Where did they go? The answer will never be fully satisfying. That is not a failure of scholarship. It is simply what the past is. A place most of whose inhabitants left no forwarding address, no note, no trail visible from where we are standing. Consider what that means. Every generation that has ever lived produced, in the ordinary course of living, more history than anyone managed to record. The ratio of lives to chronicles has always been, at every point in human existence, overwhelmingly weighted toward the unlived. We are not the exception to this. The 10,000 are not exceptional in their invisibility. They are simply the case we happen to be looking at, the specific edge of the vast unrecorded past that this particular story chose to illuminate. Close your eyes. The desert is quiet. The stars over Carrhae are the same stars that hang over Gansu tonight, over wherever you are listening from, over every place the ancient world touched and moved on from, without leaving enough traces for us to follow. The men walked east into them. We do not know how far. We never will. That is enough. That is, in its own way, a kind of peace. Rest well.